my country, which no longer exists.
I mean, everybody lost someone. Wars are bad things.
It was typical for that time. Everyone who could leave was leaving, yeah. And even friends who did not leave immediately ended up leaving a few years later. And they left to various places. So now if I look back to that cohort, a lot of them are in the US, but there are a lot of them in Europe too, or in, Saudi Arabia, Australia, like wherever you want, all over the world.
At that point, going back home was not an option. It wasn't my war. It wasn't anything that I even remotely believed in. I couldn't pick a side. My dad was on the front line. So I had multiple cousins who ended up on the front line. First cousins who were on both sides of the conflict.
High school years were when everything was just starting and we were all new. So the end of elementary, maybe the last year of elementary school and the whole high school was when the wars were either brewing or they were starting.
As immigrants, we actually have this benefit of being able to fail because, kind of not really suffer huge consequences because we're expected to fail. We kind of come here with, very little. There's no history, very often very little money. We're kind of learning everything, and of course, you're not going to know up front what's going to happen. So take a chance.
Americans don't get as much about immigrants that when you're coming, you really don't have plan B. You're coming, that's it, right? And it has to work. And there is no other way for you to salvage the situation if it's not working. So I think that was, we came, most of us, with all the money that our parents could spare.
Most of my plans did not pan out the way I wanted them. I wanted to go somewhere I couldn't, then they wanted me, I didn't want to, and it was always
what happens when people back home need you, but you're here. And I think this is something that everyone is experiencing, not just from my area, but, from everywhere else, where you really feel torn.
Welcome to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast, where we talk to computer scientists who immigrated from their home countries for study or for work or for other reasons. In these oral history interviews, you will find established and renowned computer scientists from across academia and industry narrating their experiences of immigrating from where they grew up to a completely different land, often the US. My name is Indy Gupta, and I'm your host. A country that no longer exists. And when it did exist, until the 1990s, it was neither with the USSR, nor was it allied with NATO, but rather it was part of the non-aligned movement. A country that split in the 1990s in a rather violent way. In order to stem atrocities committed in that war, the NATO forces even bombed several parts of the country in 1999. You may remember that from the news. A country that split during the 1990s and 2000s into multiple nations and regions: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Serbia, and Slovenia. This country was called Yugoslavia. While this episode is not a history lesson about Yugoslavia or its wars, so that you may interpret the experiences of our narrators, we will provide brief context at the relevant places in this episode. According to the US Department of State's Office of Historians website, Yugoslavia was formed in 1918 after the disintegration of the Habsburg Empire, as many of the Slav minorities united with Serbia under the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes in December 1918. The US recognized it in 1919. In 1929, this kingdom renamed itself Yugoslavia, and in 1946, it became a socialist federation of 6 republics: Croatia, Montenegro, Serbia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Macedonia. According to the US Department of State's historian website, it says, although the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, also known as SFRY, was run by a communist government under its longtime president Josip Tito, Yugoslavia balanced relations between East and West. Today's lead episode features 3 computer scientists who immigrated from Yugoslavia in different decades and at different stages of their careers. I briefly describe the speakers in the order that you heard them so far. So that you may recognize them, here they are. The first voice is that of Nenad Medvidovic, now a professor at the University of Southern California. Nenad immigrated from Yugoslavia to the US in the mid to late 1980s to attend high school, and he stayed here for his BS, PhD, and professional life.
As immigrants, we actually have this benefit of being able to fail.
Our second speaker is Jelena Mirkovic, a research associate professor at University of Southern California. She immigrated from Yugoslavia to the US in the late 1990s for her PhD program and then stayed for her professional life.
It was typical for that time. Everyone who could leave was leaving.
And our third speaker is Dejan Milojicic, a distinguished technologist at Hewlett-Packard Labs. Dejan, in the early 1990s, first immigrated to Germany for his PhD, and then in the mid-1990s immigrated to the US for work.
Most of my plans did not pan out the way I wanted them.
In this episode, I cover across all our 3 narrators their school education, university in Yugoslavia for 2 of them, and university in the US for 1 of them, reasons for immigrating, adapting after immigration, especially cultural differences, and many other aspects. This is a lead episode and features excerpts from these 3 interviews. The episodes following this lead episode contain the actual full oral history interviews with these individual computer scientists. These oral history interviews are not intended to be a representative sample nor to help us draw any conclusions. They are just the personal immigration stories of 3 very well-known computer scientists who immigrated from Yugoslavia. The first segment covers high school education in Yugoslavia, and you'll hear the voices of our 3 narrators interspersed, even though I talk to each of them individually.
I grew up when we were still together and everyone was supposedly liking each other. And, as kids, we really grew up in this environment where we were taught that this is one country, we are one people, we were always meant to be together. And the ideals of the both the union and the fight for the union, which was actually occurring during the Second World War, and the communist ideals, these were all merged together into one story. And I think this story is still with me. I think story is still with everyone that kind of grew up in that same time frame. We still feel like we are part of Yugoslavia. We really, the 90s and the wars were kind of, nightmare that interrupted this dream of ours, but the dream is still living. We are still feeling more part of Yugoslavia than any single country that resulted from the split. So we weren't really under heavy influence of USSR because we were, in a way, independent between East and West. We were one of a few countries that kind of avoided being under USSR. But I believe that some aspects of teaching science did come from USSR, and I remember, preparing for math competitions, we would use Russian books with the problems to prepare.
What was schooling like in those days? I understand that Yugoslavia back in those days had two kinds of schools, trade schools and gymnasiums. Which one did you go to among those?
Right. So it was, for one thing, in those days, Yugoslavia we considered it a socialist country. And in fact, the word socialist was in the name of the country. But in the West, even to this day, it is sometimes referred to as a communist country. And one of the things for people who are familiar with that sort of societal, I guess, and governmental organization, you would know that the government put a lot of stock in educating the population. So one of the things that happened in my country, which no longer exists, was that soon after the Second World War, they went on this campaign that pretty much eliminated illiteracy, for example. So education was very important, which kind of flies in the face of this common assumption that, in fact, under communism, they wanted to control the population. So somehow you have to reconcile the fact that they wanted us highly educated and at the same time that there was indeed a certain level of control. So by the time I finished elementary school, which in the US, that would be the combination of elementary and middle school. So in other words, by the time I finished 8th grade and was ready to go to high school, the country was experimenting with a model of high school education where you would do 2 years of kind of general high school education, and then you would move into, essentially it would be like a college major, but at the level of high school. So the first 2 years would be kind of shared by everybody, and then the subsequent 2 years people would do things like math or biology or programming or English or whatever. So I went to what was traditionally a gymnasium, but at that time it was really kind of switched over to this new system, and it was shared really across all these various schools, including many of the trade schools. So you could have gone to what traditionally was a technical school, for example, that would be geared toward tradesmen or tradespeople, I suppose, and engineers. But those students would have the same basic kind of education that I would get. Just the schools were not as highly regarded necessarily still. But anyway, so that experiment lasted for some number of years and eventually was scrapped because my own high school education my experience was very fragmented, not only because of that, also because after my third year of high school, I actually left and came to the US. But we can talk about that later. Yeah. But I think this 2+2 business is very kind of unsettling for somebody. You kind of never got to hit your stride. And also the narrowly focused and a very intensive education in a given area, maybe, it does have some merit to it, but it was a little bit too early. At the age of 16, for example, you started focusing very, very deeply into or onto a given topic or set of topics. And it was an interesting pedagogical experiment that I think many people would say was not a particular success.
In your school education, did you use any textbooks or was it just spoken?
Yeah, there were a lot of textbooks. I remember when I would go to summer vacations, I found textbooks from my relatives for the advanced years after because I was alone there, I read them. I wasn't studying, I was just reading them. So again, I felt like I was exposed by pure coincidence in advance of what normally you would study. So I would come back to school, I already knew most of the stuff.
And what language were these textbooks in?
It was all in Serbian.
All in Serbian.
Both in Serbia and Croatia, they were, the same language, basically.
Was it common to have English textbooks back then at all?
Only when I went to university.
Two of our narrators did their bachelor's degrees at the University of Belgrade. Dejan Milojicic, who graduated from University of Belgrade in 1983, and Jelena Mirkovic, who graduated from University of Belgrade in 1998. We talked to both of them about education in the University of Belgrade. Next, moving on to your college year. So it's around 1978 when you started your BSc. So as you're considering university, did you have a choice of major? Do you actually choose electrical engineering, or was it through some exam system? How was the admission process?
No, at the beginning you choose which university you go to. So that's all Belgrade University. So I chose faculty of electronic and electrical engineering. And the first year was common for everybody. At that time, there was electronics, there was power and energy, and there was automation and a few others centers. But the first year was common for everyone. And then in the second year, I was expected to choose where to go, and I chose electronics. I still don't know why, but that's what I chose. It appealed to me somehow. It was more interesting than everything else.
And were there constraints on the choice in the sense of, you could choose something only if you have a good enough GPA? I mean, was it competitive to choose particular majors over others?
I don't think there were any issues at that time. They wanted to balance, so they opened up to anyone, as far as I remember. You couldn't get the first year because, they wouldn't accept everyone. But once you're in, they allow us to choose which direction to take.
Focusing on your just BSc years, 1978 to 83, how much emphasis would you say was there on the electrical and electronics engineering side versus the software side in those years of education?
There wasn't any software. I'm not sure that I've done any software until I started working, which was in 83. Even the first program that I wrote, it was nothing. It was Fortran for some computers. I almost didn't do any software. It was all electronics and, electromagnetism and engineering. It was all engineering. I got interest in programming only in the Master of Science and then while working in parallel.
Let's talk about your transition to University of Belgrade. How did you come to select computer science when you moved to university?
Okay, so the schooling works differently there too. So you don't really select your major. You have to decide when you're applying to the university which major you are. You cannot just easily switch like here. And so I was deciding, I mentioned to my math teacher, to the one that I looked up to, that I wanted to go into computer science. And I said, I'm deciding between applying to for a math degree or for a electrical engineering degree. So these were two schools that were teaching computer science. So, and you would start with this basic degree, either math or electrical engineering. And then by the end of your education, maybe in the last 2 years, you would get more computer science topics and less these, let's call it general education topics. It's really not general education, but like in electrical engineering, you learn about electrical circuits and, telecommunications and, this and that. And then later you would go into and learn more about programming.
I want to ask you a little bit about women in computer science in Belgrade. Would you say there were a lot? Would you say there were few? What was your memory of that?
I would say there was a fair number. Maybe not 50%, but it was a fair number. We definitely weren't we weren't a significant minority, let's say. Maybe like 30 to 40%.
That's a healthy percentage. And my understanding from what I'm hearing from you is that the encouragement of parents for their kids to go into math and science played a part in that. And there was no strong social bias against being in math and science.
Yeah, there was no social bias at all against it. And I think that what parents perceived was that there was a handful of schools, there still are, in Belgrade that are regarded as prestigious. And so School of Electrical Engineering was definitely, one of those near the very top, if not on the top. So everyone would be proud for their kid to go there. It was not in any way socially unacceptable for any gender to go there.
That professor I liked a lot. There's interesting story with him I'd like to share. He was really tough. He was the toughest. It's not like in the United States where everybody passes or most everybody passes all the time. It's just difference in grade. He prevented a lot of students to finish university, not on purpose, but he maintained some standard, and if you don't meet that standard, he doesn't let you pass. So he was really, everybody was afraid. One of my best friends stopped university because of him. He could never pass his exam. So I took that exam, not on the first occasion when I was given opportunity, but on the second. And I did, it was success to even pass, to get the lowest grade. It was really, and I did, but he said, okay, here's the grade, go away. And I said, I don't want it, the way he told me. And so I rejected it, and people were shocked that I've done that. So I come for the next exam, and I get the same grade. It was all written, both. He wasn't there, and I felt stupid. Okay, I canceled the first time, so I canceled the second time. So I get third time in front of him, and in the meanwhile, because he was horrible presenter, teacher. He was very smart, but he couldn't explain anything. Everyone has his strengths and weaknesses. So I clarified everything, with him. I went, met him personally, asked him everything. I felt I knew everything, but the trick with him is he always comes up with new questions because he wants you to think, not to just learn, he wants you to come, even in the exam, with completely new solutions. So he asked me one question, and I said, I don't know. He asked me second question, I said, I don't know. And he said, okay, go sit back in the room and wait. And it was all good. I don't mind waiting, but I was supposed to fly that night to the seaside to meet my nowadays wife. And he didn't ask me. So, 1 hour passes, second hour passes. So I keep on asking, hey, can you, I'm still here. Can you ask me, are you rushing for the train? I said, no, for the plane. And so eventually he asked me and asked me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. I knew everything. And he gave me the middle grade, which was still great. I got 8 out of 10. The 6 is passing. So
the other difference was that the way exams work here and back home is different. So exams here are throughout the class. You have the midterm and you have the final, and it's a one-shot thing, right? Or you repeat the class. Whereas back home, you have the class, and then after class, you have multiple chances to take the exam, up to maybe 4 or 5 times that year. And then if you don't pass it, or if you maybe pass it with a grade you don't like, you can cancel it and try again. And then, that's pretty much flexible when you actually pass that exam. And then once you pass it, then more courses open that you can take.
You're listening to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast. This is the lead episode on the country that no longer exists, Yugoslavia. Next we hear Nenad Medvidovic, who immigrated from Yugoslavia to the US in the late 1980s to finish his last few years of high school.
In late 85, there was an announcement at my high school that some number of students were going to be able to go to the US through this exchange program, and that we should apply. So I went through the whole process, and I don't want to bore you with the details of that, but it involved a huge amount of paperwork, as you might imagine, and some, psych exams and things like that. It was competitive, and also they wanted to make sure that, at the time I didn't understand why, but in retrospect, of course, that you're suitable for being separated from your family for that long. And, I got, the first time I saw a Rorschach test was when I was 17. I had just turned 17, and I was going through this test, and the psychiatrist had to sign some paperwork and whatnot. And then based on all that, they found a family in the US who was interested in having a foreign exchange student whose kind of background and wishes, I guess, matched mine. And that's how I ended up in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Scottsdale, Arizona. And you went to school there for a year?
Yeah, in the fall of 1986, so sometime late August, early September, I don't remember the exact date, I started attending as a high school senior, Saguaro High School in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was a completely different experience. Everything was different. Nothing was the same. Not the least the language, obviously, which I did not really speak at the time. But also the fact that you only took whatever it was, 6 classes, but you took them every single day. So there was much less variety in the material you were studying, but huge amounts of it. So when it was initially explained to me, for example, that typically on Fridays we have tests, that seemed really weird to me, because there was no way that in Yugoslavia we would have covered enough material in a week's time, because we met maybe twice or 3 times a week, to have a test every week. Here it was just a sprint, and it would not end for the the duration of the whole semester kind of thing. So it was a very interesting experience. That was by far the kind of the most I have been, or the farthest I should say, I have been outside my zone of comfort ever in my life. So obviously being away from everything I knew. I mean, I could tell you stories about the first time I saw my host dad pop in a pouch of something into this device and press some buttons, and all of a sudden, you had the smell of popcorn. It felt like a scene from the Jetsons, because I didn't know what a microwave was. Not only did I not know how one works, but I had no idea what one was. I didn't know that thing existed, right? So it was things like that where I had to sort of pick up my jaw off the floor repeatedly and kind of remember to just sort of act cooler than maybe I was feeling on the inside. But quite frankly, the biggest mistake I made was because of this kind of silly pride, I guess, that you have when you're around 18. I was almost 18 at the time. When my host mom went with me to sign up for classes, which is something you didn't do in Yugoslavia, so I didn't understand the process at all. I didn't appreciate that that's basically the next year of your life. I was sitting in a room with a person whose role in my life I couldn't appreciate, I didn't understand. Turns out he was a high school counselor. Again, this is a concept we did not have back in Yugoslavia. And at one point, they were discussing things. So my math, that was really easy. Science, I had taken so much of it that I didn't have to worry about it. World history, I had taken a bunch of, so they put me into a U.S. history class. So all of this was kind of straightforward. It sort of fell out of kind of my background and what needed to be done for me to actually get a high school diploma. But then at one point, they turned to me and asked, you understand what we're saying, right? Something to that effect. And of course I didn't, but I was embarrassed to say that I didn't, so I just nodded my head and said yes. And they ended up putting me into college composition. Which was probably the toughest class that you could throw a non-native, actually almost a non-speaker, into, and that was by far the most challenging thing. Was kind of understanding the language. I had a wonderful teacher who, for the first maybe 3 months of the first semester, would just give me check marks because. He said my English was so poor that just on that basis alone, he would have had to fail me. So that was incredibly generous of him. The class itself turned out to be pretty fantastic. I learned a lot about writing because the entire class was conceived around the concept of being able to express an idea and write an essay and so on. And of course, just like you, I spent most of my professional life writing. So that really kind of put me on a very good path toward where I was eventually going to get to, because that class was also incredibly hard for me. I couldn't understand, it wasn't the material that I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand the concept of taking a class on the principles of a country's government. That's just not something that could, penetrate my engineering skull, I suppose. One thing kind of as a quick aside, one thing that was completely unfamiliar to me that this guy, Scott, that I mentioned, kind of sensitized me to is this notion of extra credit. Because to me it was, weird that on a test, I would get a C because half the questions I couldn't even understand initially. And my grade for the class would be C. Scott would get a C on the test, but his grade would be a B or an A. So, what's the difference? And then he explained that, when the teacher says you could do these things for extra credit, you do them and you actually get more points. And, it was just a lot of this stuff that was, sitting in a courtroom in downtown Phoenix, for example, to get credit for my U.S. government class, and just kind of watching what the criminal defense attorneys and the prosecutors say and so on for a couple hours. That was just not something that seemed normal to me, but I got the hang of it quickly and started doing things like that.
Sounds like you had an easier time with the math class and the computer science and programming class than with the English or government classes. Is that a correct statement?
Absolutely. I mean, math was, I was immediately put into calculus, AP, which I didn't know the concept of AP meant nothing to me, but that was a lot of fun. It was, challenging in the right ways. I could, you could dock numbers easily. That's super easy. Same thing with programming, but English, eventually, since I was a good writer, and one thing that even nowadays my students sometimes can't understand, the command of the language is one aspect of writing, but really it's sort of the logical laying out of the concepts and the ideas is just as important, the structure of what you're trying to say. Or as my English teacher from that year, Mr. Stewart, used to say, form follows function. That was the one thing that he repeated 5 million times during that year. But I do have to say that I felt a little uneasy about the level of what I felt at the time was indoctrination into kind of the capitalistic mindset. Basically, the kind of the notion that Adam Smith had it all figured out, and this is the gospel, right? And then everything else kind of falls out naturally. That was to my kind of young, uneducated mind, that was an interesting set of concepts to sort of work through and figure out how I reconcile them with everything I'd learned prior to that in my life, and this kind of more socialist point of view where you sort of help the weaker ones and the profit is not kind of the end all be all and so on.
We talked about their very first experiences of using computers and of learning their first programming.
Had one class that was the only class available. It was called informatics, I think, in the 9th grade. And that was the first time I've ever seen a computer. We were learning BASIC. And we were learning just, hello world and this and that. And I remember liking it so much. I would come after class and, try to program. We had a trivia show on TV called Quizkoteka, where, there are certain questions and answers, like multiple choice answers, and you have to choose one. And I would program that in BASIC as a like a mini game.
I didn't get my first computer until late into my junior year in high school, and that was a Commodore 128 that my dad's brother brought in from Germany. But then I also remember my mom being really disappointed that you actually had to plug the computer into the TV, because that meant that I would usurp the TV and nobody else would be able to watch it.
There wasn't any software. I'm not sure that I've done any software until I started working, which was in '83. Even the first program that I wrote, it was nothing. It was Fortran for some computers. I almost didn't do any software. It was all electronics and, electromagnetism and engineering. It was all engineering. I got interest in programming only in the Master of Science, and then while working in parallel.
Naturally, they brought up the backgrounds of their parents. We hear from all three of them next.
They were born both in a village, different villages. So my mother was born in a village in Croatia, and she, she had a very difficult life. Her schooling was interrupted by war. She learned to read only as an adult, and went to finish I'm not sure even if that was like a high school or just like a 2-year degree for a dental assistant, and she ended up having a career as a dental assistant. And my father was born in a village in Serbia, and then finished only elementary school and ended up being like a firefighter for a good part of his life until he met my mom fairly late in life. And then they relocated to Belgrade, and he ended up finishing high school and an associate degree late in life, post 40 years old.
I was born in a small yard where there were a number of families. I think there were about 5-6 families all living in one yard. I was the youngest kid. Unfortunately, my mom died when I had 5 months. So all these women in the yard were taking care of me. So sometimes when I'm hearing and listening here today about diversity, inclusion, these things just came naturally to me because I was, raised by all these women. And if I would ever do something wrong, they would correct me on the spot. In that yard, I think I have about 5 or 6 aunts who felt responsibility for me. So they taught me all kinds of things as I was growing up. So I remember, for example, they improvised a small board in the yard and we used chalks and they taught me math. So I was exposed to especially math as I was growing up. That was initial lesson, but the true expertise I received by going with my grandmother to the farmer's market, where I was always in the background making sure that she's not cheated by the salesman. So that's how I think I got my first math exposure.
So this yard that you grew up in, was this kind of a communal living, like a kibbutz commune type thing? Was this a common thing in Yugoslavia in those days, or was it special?
I think it was more by necessity. My grandparents immigrated from a Serbian inhabited area from Croatia. There are 3 areas there. Nikola Tesla is from one of these areas. We're from the neighboring area. So they all moved, and a number of families, a number of sisters and brothers moved. So they all established their living in Belgrade. And they came into that yard, which originally was one family house. But by necessity, they split into all these rooms and built their own homes. The interesting thing is it was in the center of the town. So you would never expect all these small homes in the middle of the town.
And this was in Belgrade itself?
That was in Belgrade. There was a big place called Slavia, and that's where I grew up.
My mom was especially early on, while I was sort of, this piece of putty that somebody could form into an individual. My mom was very important in instilling a work ethic. Sometimes maybe even using draconian measures by today's standards. Where on the other hand, my dad did too. I remember once I got the equivalent of an A- because I did the whole test right. I brought it home, did the whole test right, and omitted the middle N in my first name. Just forgot it when I signed it, and the teacher basically docked me for that. I remember my dad forced me to write my first and last name 100 times. So it was, from that point on, I remembered how to write my first name. It was, I don't think I made a mistake once, right? But it was really my mom who insisted that homework be done. There was this kind of unspoken deal that I never really had a curfew as a kid, as long as I brought home good grades. And at that point, it was clear that good grades meant straight A's or the equivalent thereof. My parents basically let me do things that I enjoyed within limits, obviously.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast. This is the lead episode on the country that no longer exists, Yugoslavia. The Balkan Wars in the 1990s and early 2000s influenced the lives of all our three narrators. In the 1990s, Jelena was doing her schooling and then university in Belgrade until 1998 when she moved to the US. In the 1990s, Nenad was already in the US doing his schooling, BS and PhD. And in the 1990s, Dejan was already in Germany finishing his PhD, and then he moved to the US. We hear from all three of them next.
High school years were when everything was just starting and we were all new. So the end of elementary, maybe the last year of elementary school and the whole high school was when the wars were either brewing or they were starting. And there were a lot of friends that, had brothers drafted into army and, coming back looking as and behaving as zombies and, with PTSD. And so that was that was a big unknown that impacted all of us, I think, at that time. And then when we went to university, for our generation at least, there was more turbulence in Serbia. There were demonstrations against the regime, and we all participated in those, and we were hoping that this will make a difference, and it wasn't really making a difference immediately. It took years and years and years.
That was very difficult. At that time, there was a TV station called Skola, which you might actually not remember because you're younger than I am. It was, and certainly, telling kids nowadays what it was like is it's just this imaginary world that they can't comprehend. There was no internet. There was basically, we had just started using email, and that was the select few who were, in places of higher learning and so on. And Skola was, and then I was still writing letters back and forth with my parents. So, a letter would take somewhere between 7 and 10 days to arrive. Sometimes it wouldn't arrive for a month. Sometimes it wouldn't arrive at all. So getting information back and forth was very difficult.
Did you call them? Or did you speak on the phone?
Yeah. Calling them was very tricky because
expensive too, I guess.
AT&T had a plan that would a minute would cost over $2, which at that time was unimaginably expensive for me. But on weekends, so Saturday morning after 2 a.m. and Sunday morning after 2 a.m., it would be like 84 cents a minute or something like that. So many late Saturday nights, early Sunday mornings, I would, force myself with the aid of coffee, sometimes Vivarin, in fact, to stay up. Sort of medicate yourself so you can speak to your parents, kind of thing. So I could at least hit the cheaper rate, but it wasn't practical for me to call them too much because I just didn't have any money. So there was a place at my university that was actually showing Skola. It was one of the libraries or something like that. And I would go there to watch the news. And since the country just quickly disintegrated, every night they would have, or every day rather, they would have the nightly news from Belgrade from the previous night. And they would also have the news from 5 days ago from Croatia. So the Croatian news, for whatever reason, from Zagreb were 5 days old. From Belgrade, they were a few hours old. And I would watch that to stay up to speed, and it was incredibly unnerving. I felt like somebody was just kind of ripping my heart to shreds. It was that hard to see my country fall apart like that. And then my dad I had multiple cousins who ended up on the front lines. My dad was on the front line. I've had first cousins who were on both sides of the conflict. So it was just very messy because I come from a mixed marriage, ethnically mixed marriage.
So returning to your timeline, around the time that you're graduating from UC Irvine with your PhD, 1999, that's when the war in the Yugoslavia area is really reaching its peak. Did you at that point of time, or actually any time after that in the decade that followed, consider going back at all?
No. So the war kind of reached its peak at the most inopportune time for me. I had a baby boy. So I graduated technically. I defended and turned my dissertation in in December of 98, but the degree didn't get conferred until 1999. And in January of 99, I actually started my new job at USC. And I immediately had to start teaching, and I had to start teaching a class that had not existed before, so I had to put it together. At the same time, my mom arrived to help with my son, and that's when the NATO bombing of what we called the rump Yugoslavia, so Serbia and Montenegro, began because of the atrocities that were happening in Kosovo at the time against the Albanians. So it was on every single front. I felt like I was just basically taking on water. I was just sinking in every possible way. My home life was incredibly tense. We're not getting very much sleep because of the baby. My mom is here. My dad and sister are there. The bombs are getting dropped on them, as are all my cousins and aunts and uncles and so on. And of course, the job was very demanding, as I'm sure you remember from early on. I mean, everything is new. You're trying to figure everything out. You're trying to take on new students. You're trying to get funding, all this stuff, right? So it was not the funnest part of my life. Let's put it that way. The first couple of years they really took a toll. And part of the reason I think even my marriage disintegrated was because there was just so much stress surrounding everything. And it's very difficult to figure out kind of how to deal with all of that. And then, it goes away. It kind of, you find a different path. So in the long run, it's fine. I mean, it's 1999 through, let's say, 2002-3. I wouldn't necessarily want to go back to that time. It wasn't the kind of, I don't have the fondest memories of those years. And any one of those things would have been hard. Raising small children, difficulties in whatever your personal relationships are. Obviously, war. And then of course starting a new career as an academic, which can be very stressful. But despite that, I mean, going back was just never an option for me. I maybe I'm a minority. I know there are people who are kind of like me. There are not that many of us, but there are people who, I've spoken to who have said basically that once Yugoslavia fell apart, that was it. Like there was nothing left behind that they felt was theirs or where they felt they belong. And I'm one of those people. I know I'm a significant minority, but that's just how it is. Well, for one thing, it's not one country. It is kind of the places that I generally tend to go to. It's four. Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro, Serbia. Each one of them is very different from every other one. Each one of them is, I hope that, people don't get, from that region especially, don't get angry at me for saying this, but each one of them is dysfunctional in its own way. So going back is mostly, it's fun as a way of kind of reminiscing, seeing places where I grew up and I remember from my childhood, and also seeing friends and family. Any kind of more global sort of perspective would get me deeply depressed, so I try not to think about it.
Returning to the point where you moved to Germany to do your PhD, and this is 1991, and you were there till 1994.
Really end of 1993.
93. There was a language change. There was, of course, a culture change. I want to ask about, what the cultural differences were and what was the hardest thing for you when you moved to Germany. And I also want to ask about, how it was managing your family with, you mentioned 2 kids.
Well, let's start with the more important, managing family with 2 kids. It was not easy, but if you ask my wife, she probably would say that was the best time of her life. Because Germany as a country, it's very nice to kids. They have all kinds of opportunities there, and they went to the preschool, the older daughter, the younger one had a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of parks, a lot of amusement parks, and Europe in general, they take care of kids substantially. So, but at the same time, it was a small apartment, 1 bedroom and a kitchen. We even had my mother-in-law come. She slept in kitchen to help my wife, because my younger daughter came, she was, I think, 8 months old. And even more interesting was that they came literally with the last flight out of Belgrade. After that, the airport was closed, so no one could fly after that. And the war started fully. We did come by buses periodically, once or twice, for the summers when things would, calm down. But it was not easy, and for me, obviously, it was tough, but I would go and work, and once you work, you focus on that.
And all the three of them had a lot of beautiful advice. If you're interested, check out the following 3 episodes of this podcast. And these episodes feature the individual interviews with Nenad Medvidovic, Jelena Mirkovic, and Dejan Milojicic. But here's some of the advice that the 3 of them had, just snippets of it.
The best advice that I got as a very young academic in my first year of my PhD studies by John King, who eventually moved on to become dean of the business school at the University of Michigan. John basically said, if it doesn't matter what your parents want, or what your loved ones want, or any person in a mentoring capacity or whatever, if you don't want to finish, you're not going to finish. And he meant specifically with respect to the PhD, but I think it applies to many other aspects of your life. If you are not the one who wants it, in the long run, it's not, that's not a recipe for success. But if you do want it, then I think it's, as you called it before, it's okay to take a leap of faith occasionally. And I think it's okay to fail. And I think that as immigrants, we actually have this benefit of being able to fail because, kind of not really suffer huge consequences because we're expected to fail. We kind of come here with, very little, there's no history, very often very little money, we're kind of learning everything. And of course, you're not going to know upfront what's going to happen. So take a chance.
I want to say, especially to graduate students, I think in undergrad, maybe the process is more forgiving and you understand that everyone's finding their way. But I think when you come to grad school, you really feel this pressure to do well. And research is such a field that, no one knows if they are doing well or not. Everything is very hard. Everything is self-driven. You don't know if you are going to succeed or not, if you're addressing important problems or not. So it's really easy to get imposter syndrome. I mean, I have it constantly. I think everyone else has it. So I think what I wanted to say is that it's completely normal and expected. And everyone has it. Even the famous people have it. I talked at some point to someone who is really well published in networking field, and I wanted advice for a paper that I kept sending around, and it just wouldn't get in. And I thought it was very well done. I couldn't see a way to make it better, but it just kept being rejected. And, he said, well, yeah, that happens to me as well. And it was a big revelation for me that it doesn't just happen to me, it happens to everyone. And as, time went on, I realized it from the other side when I became a professor, that it really happens for everyone. And, a lot of papers that we see today as very well cited papers and, amazing works in the field took years to publish because, after 6 months to a year of work on a topic, you get something that is submittable. But then, maybe it will get in, maybe you're lucky, but in most cases it doesn't. Then you have to work more on it. Then you maybe have to do more experience. It can be really prolonged affair until it gets to publication.
I think every success or every failure is there for good reason. So you have to embrace both. If you have had so-called failure, it means that you might have not been ready for that. That, like, the typical case is paper. Okay, your paper doesn't get accepted somewhere. It's not a failure. I think it's a reward for you because the paper was not good enough. You will work on that paper, you will improve it, you'll do something really good, and that paper will get accepted. So take every so-called failure with a lot of wisdom and try to learn something from that. So I started interviewing, and I got a number of offers. I think I got like 4 or 5 offers. And I remember I introduced a small process. I wrote all criteria that can lead me to making decision. Then I took that huge list and created a smaller table with those that I thought are most important. Then I asked my wife; she had her own criteria, and then I ranked all of those so that I knew all the numbers. And at that point of time, I threw all that away because I knew, what I wanted. I checked with my wife; she was okay, and I chose Hewlett Packard Labs at that time.
That was a particularly great algorithm you described for making a choice between different options. And a lot of our listeners face these choices when they have multiple offers as well, including students. Make a table, make a list of pros and cons, think about it, consult your wife, consult your family, and then essentially throw the list away and go with where your heart tells you to go to at that point. What you have heard in this episode on immigrant computer scientists from Yugoslavia, the country that no longer exists, were merely excerpts. Coming up in the next episode, Nenad Medvidovic describes life as a high school exchange student in the US and his mandatory military service in the Yugoslav army, and much, much more. All the music used in episodes of the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast is royalty-free. All voice recordings were performed with and are reproduced with full consent of the narrators and participants. You can find episode guides on csimmigrant.org and find us on social media at the handle csimmigrant. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes from the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast.